You're listening to the Knowledge Archives podcast. Welcome to the Knowledge Archives podcast. We're a group of students on a mission to learn from as many different disciplines of knowledge as possible. I'm your host, Madhav Malhotra, and today I have the pleasure of being joined by Dr. Roman Hoffmann, a postdoctoral researcher at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research in Germany. His work focuses on the impacts of environmental change in developing countries like the Philippines, especially in regards to climate migration and the ways in which populations try to prepare to manage the impacts of climate change. I'm very much looking forward to learning more about this issue that is gaining increasing urgency in today's world. Thank you for joining me today. I really appreciate you taking the time, and I'm very excited about this area of work. And to begin, I'd love to just quickly hear a little bit about your story, what you're working on right now and how you got involved in this area.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me and for your interest in this topic. I'm a social scientist with a background in sociology and economics. I studied in Munich and then continued my postgraduate studies in Vienna. And I basically started with research on development issues and challenges that countries face in the process of development. And then I continuously got interested in the topic of climate change and environmental impacts on populations. And then for the last 5 years, I have been working now more and more on this topic. I'm currently working at the Wittgenstein Center for Demography and Global Human Capital, which is a research hub for different demographic institutes and population science institutes based in Vienna, Austria. And at the same time, I'm currently employed at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, where basically social scientists come together with climate scientists to understand how climate change and environmental change affects populations worldwide. Mm-hmm. And in my research, I focus on a variety of different topics. I'm interested in climate adaptation processes and in understanding how populations adapt and cope with or do not cope with different environmental changes in their nearby environment. I'm looking into climate migration, into issues of resilience and vulnerability. I'm interested in how disasters affect populations and how populations can protect themselves against disasters. And a particular focus of our research group is on education and how education can potentially help to mitigate certain risks and help households to better prepare against hazards in their environment.
Mm-hmm. And I think what's really cool about your research is when you think about the climate change problem, oftentimes you think of the environmental aspects, and oftentimes these are the issues that get a lot of attention. But when it comes to the human impacts, we've started to see these areas getting more attention, but I think it would still be great to kind of outline what is the significance of climate change when it comes to its impact on human societies. It would be great to hear about any specific examples, maybe locations that are impacted more so, etc.
It's a very holistic question in the sense of climate and the environment and human populations. They are really deeply interconnected in a way. So us and our societies, we depend very much on the environment. And at the same time, we also, as we see now more and more, we are also one of the determining forces that change the environment, not only in a very localized context, but also in a very, very global context. And this is which brings us to the topic of climate change. So populations are in many different ways affected by the different changes that we observe at the moment in different areas. So we see, for instance, impacts on health. It's an abundance of research that looks into effects of environmental changes on health of populations. We see that economic outputs and productivity are influenced by environmental conditions. We see that issues such as food security and also peace and conflict are determined by environmental factors. And of course, and this is one of the main topics that I focus on in my work, also process of human mobility and migration are affected by environmental conditions. And this is something which there has been a relationship between all of these aspects and environmental conditions throughout basically human history. But now, of course, with the climatic changes that we have been observing in the last couple of decades, many of the problems that are related to changes in the environmental conditions and populations, they become more significant. And we see this in different regions of the world. And some regions are particularly affected, among others, for example, the Sahel zone, eastern parts of Africa, but also parts of Latin America and the Caribbean, or South Asia and Southeast Asia. So basically, it's like a lot of parts of the world are affected. For instance, recently, a third of Bangladesh got declared as being underwater. I'm not sure if you came across this news. So for a country of the size of Bangladesh, this is really a dramatic change, immediate change in its conditions, and has, of course, substantive impacts on the livelihoods of populations.
Mm-hmm. And I think that last point is, when we think about these kinds of regions that are being affected, oftentimes they're very different or far removed from the developed world, especially in North America. We don't think about all of these different impacts of climate change interacting together. But I know you've been to the Philippines to conduct research, and I just wanted to hear about your experience on the ground in terms of, do you actually see that the cultural perception is very different when it comes to people being aware of all of these risks, when it comes to everything from mobility issues to, I've seen documentaries about issues with housing and constant sea level rise impacting things there, to everything about the employment levels of different classes in the Philippines. And thinking about all that, it's very foreign for someone like looking in from the outside. But were you able to see something like that on the ground where it felt different for the society there?
So the Philippines is a country that is particularly exposed to a variety of hazards. So they are, for instance, one of the countries most affected by tropical storms. They are hit by numerous tropical storms each year. And there's quite an awareness of the population of the dramatic consequences these storms can have. And we did a lot of research looking into how the people are protecting themselves and how this is related to their awareness level. So we found, on average, quite a high awareness level among the population when it comes to these hazards. And this awareness level was mainly influenced by educational background of the people and previous experiences they had with different environmental hazards. So we do see on the ground also that the people respond to these and they change, let's say, their viewpoints on this, but oftentimes they lack simply the capacities in adequately preparing themselves. So this can be, on one side, a restriction in terms of knowledge, that they are just lacking information, but it can be very material resources that they are missing when it comes to preventing or preparing their households against certain disaster shocks. And maybe if I may just add to what you said before, I named the different examples of where we see quite a substantive impact of climate change on populations, but I didn't want to say that, let's say, the more developed world is completely excluded from many of the impacts that we see at the moment. For instance, in the US, you see that there was quite devastating wildfires that are taking place, currently ongoing in California, for instance. And these are, of course, also processes that are at least to a certain extent influenced by the broader environmental conditions. And there are studies now that show that increased drought and heat in these regions, they can really drive these processes and also foster the occurrence of wildfires.
Yes, I think that it's very important to consider the spread of this problem. It impacts everyone to different extents, but it is really it is starting to take a lot of our cultural attention everywhere. And I think it's really interesting what you pointed out in terms of how do people respond to this and figuring out the factors that underlie it, and one of the main ones being education, because I intuitively understand that a more educated population would be better able to not only understand the concepts of climate change and understand how it's impacting their lives, but also be better prepared to deal with those challenges. But when it comes to the specifics of that, I'm wondering a little bit, is it like we have government training programs to educate people what to do in case of emergencies? Are we talking about training, say, youth to, I guess, understand the impacts of climate change and think about in the future what are some of the things that we need to work more on, etc.?
And that's a very interesting question. Of course, with our research, we have to we often look into broad categories of education, for instance. So with our particular studies that we have carried out, we're mostly looking into the effects of schooling education, and we're using rather vague proxies such as years of education that a person has obtained. And we found actually quite strong relationships here. But of course, education is more broad and learning is more broad than that. And we absolutely acknowledge that there's other forms of education, other forms of learning, such as more informal ways of learning as well, that can play a role here. There's a number of studies that show that basically education programs that are successful in raising awareness among the people, these are the ones that are at the end most successful in really making people change their behavior and try to prepare better against potential shocks that they might encounter. There is also interesting studies that look into how participative learning, for instance, can be very successful here. So that is learning which takes an entire community into account and works basically very proactively with the community. And there have been very interesting results showing that this can be very successful in the end in bringing change to these communities.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe just if I may add, of course, education is an important factor, but often what we see also then is that there's complementarities between different factors. So often it's important to bring a change to one of these factors, but at the same time, it's important to not forget other important influences that might at the same time together determine whether a household is able to prepare against hazard shocks.
Mm-hmm. What would some of those be?
I'm thinking, for instance, of financial means, enabling basically household also from a financial standpoint to undertake appropriate measures. It's about structural precautionary measures. Also, local authorities, of course, play an important role in, let's say, supporting individuals and households in undertaking their precautionary actions. So it's kind of a mix of different factors that are coming together. Informational resources, knowledge resources, but also material resources, social resources also play an important role. And then this mixing governmental and political support is what really makes a difference.
Mm-hmm. It kind of gets into all of the complexities to get change as a whole. I think it's really important what you just said about enabling people to have, say, financial prosperity so that they can be empowered enough to actually go out and take the measures that they feel best will help prepare them for this. But when it comes to people designing interventions, what are some of the most common issues that we see in the different stakeholders trying to address this problem?
Yes, it's a good question. Of course, also the stakeholders or whoever is in charge of basically responsible for bringing improvement, they're also constrained in a way. And for them, often the question is where to basically invest their attention, their efforts in, and of course also their resources having the greatest impact then on the communities affected. I would like to reiterate what you just said, that at the end, what is really important is that you enable the people on one side to really protect, to provide sufficient protection for themselves and to raise their awareness. And at the same time, to make sure that also from an infrastructural level, there is sufficient protection in place. So of course, on one side, it's some of our studies were very focused on, let's say, individual household and communities and understanding, okay, how do they respond to these immediate hazards? But of course, this doesn't mean that most of the responsibilities at the end of the day should be on their shoulders, but it should be some sort of equal weight. Like outside the stakeholders and particularly political actors, they also have an important role to play in the end in taking up some of this burden and ensuring that sufficient protection is provided to the people who are actually at risk. And I guess it's needless to say, but I would still like to mention it. And when we talk about climate change and climate change impact, we know, of course, that it's often those who are least affected that are the greatest causes of the emissions that are causing the climatic changes that we see today. And often those that are the worst affected, they actually contributed the least to it. And here we have really a substantial question of climate justice about who is actually the one to carry the burden. And of course, also, it's not only, let's say, the local communities or the local actors that are in charge here, but of course also the international community, and especially those countries that have substantially contributed to the situation that we see today.
Mm-hmm. And I think here you could get into the economics of the situation, because when it comes to the end of the day, when we think about countries in Scandinavia, Russia, Canada, a lot of these countries have a lot to grow from climate change. And when we think about these incentives for different countries, the case for why they should act, I think it's very interesting to consider how do we get global cooperation here? Because when it comes to these different countries having these different incentives, how do you convince a country like Canada to go and help a country like, say, Bangladesh? A lot smaller economy, smaller everything, but there's so many more people just in this small part of the world that are very severely going to be impacted in the coming years.
It's an interesting question as well. So maybe just to mention at the beginning, of course, I mean, there's some countries that observe, let's say, different changes in their conditions, in their climatic conditions than others. And some will see basically the impact of climate change in a different way and not so severe than other countries. But what is important is that as of now, there's still a lot of unknowns and unknowns that we cannot really basically define what is actually going to happen in many ways. So you mentioned the example of Russia. And Russia, for instance, has a lot of storage of methane in the ground. And once might be released because of Russia getting warmer, we might see one of these tipping point moments where basically climate system as a whole might change. And this might again have negative impacts on Russia as well. So in the end, it's a question of what will exactly happen in the future, especially when we look in the longer run, where also today we cannot make any good projections at this moment. When it comes to questions about how to involve a variety of stakeholders, getting corporations on board, getting also, of course, the private sector on board is really key here. And I think it is, let's say, a mix of strategies of how to basically successfully involve different actors. So on one side, there's, of course, let's say, a certain moral obligation that we have towards people who are in more disadvantaged regions where they see the impacts of climate change more strongly, but also towards future generations that might, even within our own countries, experience way stronger impacts of climate change that we are basically causing today. So this moral obligation is certainly one important one that one shouldn't forget. But there's also economic incentives that can exist for certain companies to basically invest into climate protection and to also invest into the protection of populations that are affected. I will give you one example. For instance, many companies, they have outsourced activities, have outsourced some of their engagement to other countries that are now seeing some devastating impacts. You mentioned Bangladesh, for instance. They have, of course, an interest also in protecting, let's say, both their assets, but also the people who are there. It's also about the reputation of these companies at the end of the day. Of course, there's also this discussion of the green economy, if you want, that by ensuring that we invest more into mitigation and investing more into greener technologies, we would be able to, at the same time, protect our environment and then at the same time make some gains also in a, let's say, private sector level. Although this is, of course, heavily criticized, rightly up to now, because it has not really materialized in many ways, as we see still today. In many countries, we still have increasing levels of emissions, and it's certainly an important question of how to get most effectively the private sector on board together with other stakeholders. But how this is best done is still a bit of an open question, I would say. But there is, I think, certainly some interest also from the private sector, from different aspects that I just mentioned, that might motivate them or provide a rationale for investing into greening economies and into better protecting affected populations.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's really important what you just said about keeping in mind how these countries have interdependent relationships with each other from all stakeholders, from the companies to even the government. And I think this is where the topic of climate migration comes up, as if you look at the world in terms of refugees, maybe you have 70 million refugees a year. But if you look at it in terms of migrants, the number went up to 270 million, if I'm correct. And the biggest part of that were people who were migrating for work. And I think this is where it's very important to consider the impacts of climate migration, because I think not enough people actually realize the way this is interconnected with climate change causing, say, a farmer who can no longer achieve economic prosperity be forced to kind of make that choice. And in regards to that, I was wondering, in terms of the state of research right now, what do we think is the future impact that we expect from migration?
So in terms of the numbers and the figures, I mean, usually we are quite cautious with making, let's say, accurate predictions, because basically populations and societal systems are very, it's very hard to predict how they will and to forecast how they will respond to future changes in climatic conditions, in environmental conditions. And studies that have tried to do that, they usually come up with numbers ranging in the several hundred millions. But as I said, like often the methodologies that are underlying these projections forecasting, they have to really be taken with a lot of caution at the end of the day. So I personally, I would not lean myself so far out of the window to really pin down to one accurate number. But we know that climate migration is certainly an important phenomenon, and that in the future, likely with the changes that we observe at the moment, it will increase. And this can go so far that entire regions will be basically uninhabitable in the future. So people wouldn't have any other basically chance to survive without leaving the hazard zone. And expecting that this will possibly, these processes might become more severe in the future, then we possibly see an increase also in the number of migrants. But I would by far, also because of, as you mentioned, the political situation and let's say the political response to these numbers, would be very cautious with making too accurate predictions here. We see also in studies today that the climate is certainly a factor, and environmental conditions are factors that are influencing migration. But it's not that we have to imagine it now as waves of migrants getting on the move to developed nations. So this is certainly not the case, and it's not what our empirical data tells us. We see relationships, but this doesn't mean that now we have to expect waves of refugees coming in. And this is particularly important to understand that, let's say, often these discussions related to migration are often very ideologically and politically loaded. And one has to be very careful to not move into, let's say, into shallow waters here where you don't have really hard evidence backing up what you're doing. I would just like to give an example. Maybe you've seen the recent report that was published 2 days ago, I think, and has received quite a bit of media echo, which stated that they expect up to 1.2 billion climate refugees and displaced due to climatic change up to 2050. And I encourage you very much to look up how they derived this number. It's not substantiated in any way, and it's not based on any data or any good evidence, but it's not even a guess estimate, but it's wrong and misleading. And I think also us, the scientists and the scientific community, we have also a certain responsibility when it comes to providing, let's say, accurate information to the public. What you said before, I would just like to re-emphasize that migration is really a multi-causal process. It's determined by a variety of factors that, as you mentioned, they are quite closely connected to each other, and often it's also hard to determine which of the factors is now the actual cause that made people in the end migrate from their home locations. And as you can imagine, it's also not so easy in the first place to basically ask this question, because different households, different communities, they might have different conditions. They are affected by very different motivations for migrating, and this has all to be taken into account when looking into this topic of climate migration. So we have done recently a study where we have meta-analyzed different studies, quantitative studies, statistical studies that looked into the relation between climate factors and environmental change and migration. And what we saw in this study was that really context is very important factor when it comes to whether an environmental change, whether climatic change actually leads people to leave their homes. And this can be driven by a variety of factors related to the context situation. I'm just naming maybe one or two. We found, for instance, that the economic wealth in a region was an important driver, but also agricultural dependence of a region was an important underlying driver, determining whether at the end regions saw more or less climate migration compared to others. And the last point that I would like to make here is climatic factors do not necessarily always have to increase migration, but in many cases we also see that once a climatic shock hits a population, a community, we see that this leads to a reduction in mobility. possibly because the shock basically undermines the livelihoods, takes away resources that are needed for migration, and impedes people's mobility. And these so-called trapped populations, as they are often referred to, they of course also are highly vulnerable when it comes to their well-being and the consequences that a shock might have on them, simply because they don't have possibly the option to move out of an area if the conditions worsen too much.
Mm-hmm. And regarding this point of uncertainty, that finally brought me to my last question regarding the future of this area of research. I was wondering about one, what are the things that we have the biggest research gaps in that we know that we need more attention going to? And then two, how do we fill those gaps, whether it be for companies or individuals or even just academia?
So I will maybe split it up. On one side, I will focus on, let's say, more the scientific aspect to this question, and then on the other side, more the political aspect and the role of stakeholders in this. And so from a scientific point of view, the biggest gaps certainly are in understanding, let's say, how decisions of households come together with a variety of different factors and conditions that these households are exposed to, and at the end make the people to choose to migrate or to choose not to migrate. I mean, not everyone who does not migrate at the end of the day is actually trapped, but of course people also decide, even though they are exposed to some hardships, environmental hardships, to not leave their homes, and often for very good reasons, because they have some cultural bonds, some family ties, other social bonds. And I think from a research perspective, it is important to better understand really the conditions under which people decide to migrate and under which they decide to really stay in place or are forced to stay in place, where we come back to this topic of trapped populations. Another big gap in research is to understand, okay, once people have decided to move, what happens next? So mainly due to data restrictions, we have a very hard time in following migrants. As you can imagine, once a person starts a migration process, then keeping track of this person is quite difficult. And this is something I think where there's a major gap in where we can, let's say, follow up with better data in the future. Now there's more research coming out that uses social media, that uses modern technologies, let's say, to keep track of where migrants are actually going and what the different steps are in this process. Another important part is that deserves, in my opinion, more attention is the question of, after the migrants arrived in their, let's say, destination region, what happens to them? So what happens to their well-being? Do they actually see an improvement in their conditions, or did the situation maybe even get worse? We do now a couple of studies, partly in Peru, but also in India, where colleagues and I will look into how the well-being of migrants actually changes after the actual migration process. And I think this is really an important topic to look into in more detail. And in general, I think better understanding and better modeling the process leading to the migration or not, that's really, I think, an interesting field of further research. Timing of migration, for instance, not only the question about whether someone goes, but also when the person or the household decides to move. Does the person alone move, or is it the entire household? What determines this decision? What are the needs of the households in the communities that are affected? What happens with the communities that are left behind, or not left behind, but that see a large number of migrants going away? So what happens to those communities? So all of these, I think from an academic standpoint, are interesting questions that would deserve a closer inspection in the future. From a political standpoint, and this is partly linked, of course, also to the question of when more research should go into, I think really an important question is how to address the needs and the well-being of the migrants themselves. So often in our political thinking and the political debates and the narratives that we follow, we often, both in North America, but also in Europe and in other parts of the world, we often see, let's say, migrants more as large streams of migrants coming. And there is a little bit of a narrative of a threat, and one does not really basically take actually the perspective on one side of the migrants into account. I think primarily really the focus of all our political efforts should be to ensure that the people are, no matter where they come from and what the reasons were for the actual migration, that they are like protected, and that they are, the vulnerabilities of these people are reduced to a level that they can also sustain, let's say, and cope with hardships that they might encounter during their moves. And of course, before people start to migrate, and this could be an interesting area, I think, that is currently also explored by many stakeholders. Of course, there's a lot that can be done helping people to withstand shocks and to adapt to changes they see in the environmental conditions. And this is at the moment where a lot of funding is going in, that idea of trying to improve the situation of people in place, increasing their resilience towards environmental shocks. And I think this is, of course, also an important area from a political side point of view.
Yes, I think it's very important to consider these implications and these calls to action. So I think that's a great note to wrap up on. And I just wanted to thank you again for taking the time to provide all of this nuanced insight that sometimes we might not get from sensationalizing the issue or thinking of it just from one perspective.
I agree. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to also present some of our work. And I fully agree with what you said just in your last sentence. I think it's really, one has to approach this topic of climate migration, climate impacts on population with a very objective lens. And one should never forget that we're actually talking of real impacts that have potentially real damages to the people. And if you would allow me to end on this important note, I think, of course, we can talk a lot about how to improve adaptive capacities of people, how to improve resilience, how to ensure that people are not vulnerable to climate change. But the best way to actually protect our populations is to avoid climate change in the first place. And this is, I guess, now the real moment in time where we have still a chance to change something, and where governments and political actors have a chance to change something in the way how we live, in the way how we produce and how we consume. And I think this would be to the benefit not only of the people who are at the moment already being increasingly affected by climatic changes, but also to the benefit of everyone on this planet.
Definitely. Wonderful note to wrap up on.